Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. This time around, we're looking into an issue that as nuanced as Azerbaijani foreign policy and as urgent as a last-minute flight search for an escape from Baku's air pollution crisis. We're talking about Azerbaijan hosting this year's COP29, the annual climate conference where world leaders gather to say we should really do something about this climate thing and then promptly do nothing. It's the climate equivalent of saying that you'll definitely go to the gym tomorrow. Now you might be thinking, Azerbaijan hosting a major global event focused on climate action? Isn't that the same country where journalists get arrested for reporting on environmental problems? And you'd be correct. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
This year's climate summit is missing a few key guests. The US president, Brazil's president, as well as those of China, Russia, and even the Indian Prime Minister are not attending this COP. The Taliban, however, as controversial as they have been, are.
Our message to the world is that they should not think that they have given us freedom, but that we have gained freedom.
In wake of their country's growing humanitarian crisis, the Taliban seem to be looking to garner aid to alleviate the consequences of natural disasters and armed conflict. Afghanistan has been hit hard by very serious floods, erratic rainfall, and in turn, prolonged drought, which have all affected many parts of the country. In 2023, 4 large earthquakes also struck Herat province, and its population still has not recovered due to the lack of sufficient aid. The sanctions imposed on the Taliban for their heavily criticized policies have limited available help. The Taliban are also not doing their own people any favors, as they have come under fire for their treatment of women, among several controversial policies. They recently introduced laws forbidding women from speaking in public. They are also banned from almost every form of paid employment and education beyond elementary school.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, Azerbaijan hosting a climate change conference is a bit like appointing Dracula as the head of the blood bank. It's certainly ironic, but it also tells us something important about the state of international climate politics. It's all about optics rather than actual progress. Azerbaijan is a petrostate, meaning that its economy is heavily reliant on fossil fuels. You know, the stuff supposedly causing the climate crisis we're all trying to fix. At this point, we might as well let the tobacco industry host a lung health summit. The country's oil and gas sector accounts for around 90% of Baku's exports, and is ruled by a government that's allergic to criticism, and I mean that literally. In Azerbaijan, pointing out environmental issues is seen as a personal attack against the ruling Aliyev family, which is why so many activists and journalists end up in jail. Take Gubad Ibadoglu, for example. He's an Azerbaijani economist who dared to suggest that relying solely on oil exports isn't the best long-term strategy. For this, he wasn't invited to speak at COP29, as you might think. Instead, he was arrested earlier this year. His real crime was not believing in the fairy tale that Azerbaijan is leading the charge on climate action. He's currently sitting in jail while President Ilham Aliyev is sitting at COP29 telling world leaders that Azerbaijan is fully committed to climate goals. And that brings us to the big question. Why is Azerbaijan hosting COP29 in the first place? Well, the short answer is PR, and lots of it. Azerbaijan's ruling regime is keen on using international events like these to polish its image. It's the same playbook we saw when Azerbaijan hosted the Eurovision Song Contest and the European Games. These events are all about distracting from the government's human rights abuses. It's like when you see a really flashy commercial for a cruise line that's being investigated for dumping waste into the ocean. Sure, the footage of people lounging on a deck sipping margaritas looks nice, but you know, there's something grimy below the surface. Now, by hosting COP29, Azerbaijan gets to present itself as a modern, progressive nation while conveniently ignoring its ongoing crackdown on dissent and free speech. If you speak out about the government's environmental policies, you're branded a traitor. If you stay silent, you're complicit in the problem. It's a classic authoritarian catch-22. Azerbaijan hosting COP29 is a masterclass in irony and hypocrisy. It's a reminder that the global stage is often less about solving problems and more about who can put on the best show. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Bruce Pannier, board member of Caspian Policy Center. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express. So we are looking at the COP29 today, and one of the things that we immediately notice is that leaders from China, India, United States, Germany, the four countries that adds up to about 78 to 80% of carbon emission, decided to not send their leaders. Does that showcase the lack of political will to actually tackle the climate issue in this particular summit?
You know, I mean, in some cases, it kind of reflects the fact that, industrial nations, which are actually ramping up production and still based on a lot of hydrocarbon resources for that, are having a hard time trying to strike a balance with that. I mean, we saw the Argentinian president walked out, today. So, it's a real fine line for some countries. I think everyone's behind, or at least most countries are behind, decarbonization and trying to meet some of these goals to alleviate the problems of climate change. At the same time, they're responsible for the economies of their own countries and making sure that people are gainfully employed, meaning that you have to keep factories and other things open and keep power plants running so that people have electricity and heating in their homes. So it's very, very difficult situation, complicated to try to say, like I said, strike a balance here about what you need. The fact that they didn't choose to send anybody there, of course, is not a good sign. Clearly, there's some disagreement over what the goals are and how they should be achieved.
Right, like you mentioned, these countries, well, most countries are actually behind the goals they set for themselves, and that's kind of the reoccurring theme of all the climate summit that has been occurring. Is it high time that we start rethinking the model or how we set these type of goals? If it's never a realistic one, why would they set these type of goals?
Boy, that is a difficult question. I'm not saying that certainly the problem is real, and there's thousands probably of different models and experts who have come forward and said this is the situation, and there's always some differentiation between them, from the more moderate to the extreme, and you can pick and choose what you want out of that and say, this is the model that we're looking at and this is the one we think is most credible. Trying at the same time that they're we mentioned that they're still based on hydrocarbons for most of their economies in these countries. And, in the case of China, of course, they're burning a lot of coal. In the case of Russia, they're burning a lot of coal, too. They might be in the United States. We don't know. But they are at least interested in green or renewable energy. And there's been a movement toward that. So there is some progress on that front. But at the same time, there's what you want, where you want to be in 10 or 20 years, and there's what you got to do right now. Again, to keep your population heated, have electricity, and be able to maintain the means of production in your own countries too. And so it's very, very difficult to say you can't decouple at this point and say we're moving over to green. That would mean essentially huge power outages, an enormous effort to try to build the renewable energy resources, develop the renewable energy resources, and then develop the power plants that are going to use these resources and spread them. And the time lag is probably a decade between that at least. So you can't decouple from hydrocarbon power at the moment. And countries don't like to feel that they're being pressed into this. But moreover, I think it's embarrassing when they come forward and at a conference like this and would have to say that we agree with this, but we can't do it right now, or we're not going to do it. And they're on record publicly and in the media as having said, we're just not going to do it at this moment. It looks bad. So probably, I suppose, the better way to get out of the whole issue is to just not show up.
Right. And speaking of showing up, we're looking at the leaders who didn't show up. And one of the leaders that did show up actually represents the Taliban. Bruce, I don't know how I feel about this.
This is a tough issue. They have the same problem with humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. There are very, very few countries to support the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. However, in fact, they are in charge of Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan is one of the countries that's being hit hardest by climate change. Just this year, we've seen, massive flooding. It was true in Central Asia. It's been true in parts of eastern Iran also this year. So clearly something's going on. There's been a drought in the region for the last 3 or 4 years prior to this massive flooding. So you have sympathy for the people, and you want to help them out. And it's clear that Afghanistan is getting hit hard by this problem. In fact, according to some estimates, they're the country number 6 in terms of impact from climate change at the moment. So it's cruel to leave the people of Afghanistan on their own with this, and you want to be able to help them. Now, the Taliban are not there in an official capacity. It's very interesting. This is a semantics game, right? They've been invited as an observer, which means they cannot participate in the full assembly meetings of this group, but they are allowed to hold bilateral meetings with people and I suppose just get together for some tea or something and talk about what other individual countries can do to help them alleviate the effects of climate change in their own country. Because again, it's a very difficult act to try to pull off, but you want to help the Afghan people without helping the Taliban government solidify their own position as the rulers of Afghanistan. So inviting them is probably a good idea, at least to listen to what they have to say. There may be some solutions that are possible to provide to them that don't necessarily do anything, or at least I would say on the balance, they do more to help the people than they do to help the Taliban solidify their position as rulers of Afghanistan. So it probably doesn't hurt at the moment. I mean, I know there's some people have some problems with inviting the Taliban to anything because they're not recognized as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, but they are in de facto the government of Afghanistan, and the people are getting hit pretty hard and suffering a lot from the effects of climate change. So it's worth it probably to let them at least explain to individual parties what the situation is in their country and see if there isn't some form of aid or assistance that can be given to Afghanistan which will benefit the people.
Right, and do you think the incentive for the Taliban to attend is more of actually tackling the climate issue or the environment, or for them is it more of a PR move?
Yeah, well, see, this is the problem. I think the Taliban look at this as more of an acceptance. That being invited at all shows that people are actually recognizing that they're in charge of Afghanistan. And again, this is another problem. It's a very sensitive issue, and like I said, you want to help the people. At the meantime, you don't want to make it do anything, or at least a lot of countries do not want to do anything to make it look like the Taliban are the legitimate government of Afghanistan. So by inviting them, you do give the image that this is the legitimate government of Afghanistan. But I suppose if you wanted to make the argument, you could say they know better than anyone what the situation is with climate change and how it's affecting the country in Afghanistan, because they are in Afghanistan and they are getting better information than anyone else about what's happening in Afghanistan. So as a source of information about climate change, they're probably invaluable. Having to invite them there as representatives of the country of Afghanistan is problematic.
All right, and moving back to the COP29 summit and the seemingly lack of enthusiasm, do you think the situation with the global economy is having an impact on the political situation in some of these Western countries, which kind of led to the lack of will to really address this at this time being?
Yeah, I mean, that does have some, definitely some impact on what's going on. Again, there's been a lot of criticism, practically in every country of the world, that they're not doing enough to get their economies up and running. But again, that presumes that if you're going to get your economy running at 100% or even try to boost it past expectations, you're going to need power background for that. You're going to need some energy systems that are putting out the electricity and whatever else you need to run to run the economy, literally to run the economy. Now, if all you got, in the case of China again, or actually we could even mention Kazakhstan here too, when the basis of their electrical generation is still coal, it's hard you can't cut that out right now because you don't have an immediate substitute for it. So what you're basically saying is you're going to have to take an economic cut and you have to start your transition to renewable energy right now, and now you're going to have a 3 or 4 year period where all of a sudden your economy is going to shrink, your production levels will go down, unemployment presumably will go up, and you'll have a lot of social problems, not only from unemployment, but from the fact that households won't have the electricity and heating that they're accustomed to. So it's a rough period, and I think a lot of countries again are saying that we're on board with the idea of decarbonization, and we're on board with green energy. The problem is that we're moving toward it, maybe slower than many people wish, but it is not realistic to make the transition at this moment. We need more time, 5, 10 more years before we're in a position where we can say, okay, we're not going to burn coal. We're not going to use so much oil. We're going to have electric cars, whatever. But right now, it's just unrealistic to do that because you can't change overnight, simply.
Right. When it comes to Western countries, we're more familiar with their climate goals as well as some of the bottlenecks and challenges that they're facing. But when it comes to Central Asia, I know that you are a board member of the Caspian Policy Center and you're very well versed with the situation over there. Can you help us understand a little bit about their perception towards the climate issue? Do they focus more on the economic development aspect, or do they also have a vested interest in this?
They do. It's kind of from both sides, right? I mean, a country like Kazakhstan is a major oil exporter, and a country like Turkmenistan is a major natural gas exporter. So obviously they have a specific interest in keeping the status quo as it is right now, because this is one of their big money makers are actually hydrocarbons. At the same time, they're in the same situation as Afghanistan in terms of climate change. So. They have experienced 3 summers of drought. They had heavy flooding this year, which some people would attribute to as a natural result of climate change, where you're going to get these brief periods where all of a sudden the rainfall will come in huge amounts, and then you go right back to drought again. So they have been taking measures for this, and they are developing green energy, wind farms, solar power, on and on, green hydrogen. So they are making some big progress at that. At the same time, they are making some effort to transition to potential green energy exports. One of the things at COP29 that's being discussed is a green energy power transmission line, which involves Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan on the other side of the Caspian Sea. They're going to use solar and wind to generate 1,000 megawatts of electricity and transfer that via a transmission line along the Black Sea to Europe. So they're going to export electricity to Europe, which they say is all going to come from green energy. So there is potential to make some profit. You can replace your oil and gas exports to some extent by switching over to green energy and using that to generate electricity and then exporting that, and then you have revenue from that.
Great. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Great. Always great to be here.
Cheers. And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Now, starting off with the war in Ukraine, Russia is reportedly poised to launch a massive attack against Ukraine during the winter. Officials in Kyiv warned that Moscow has been stockpiling missiles and strategic aviation equipment.
All across the front line, Ukrainian soldiers are preparing for what some say could be a decisive push in the war. Russian forces are clearly up to something, as on Wednesday they hit Kyiv with their first missile strike since August. Some reports indicate that these latest attacks will be followed by others, all meant to weaken Ukraine's power grid ahead of the tough winter months. Last winter wasn't easy on the Ukrainian population or the soldiers fighting to defend their country. The poor conditions affect both the aggressor and the defender, though both armies have become prepared for them as the war has gone on. The Ukrainians, at least, have a little bit of warmth, knowing that they are the ones fighting for their homes.
And speaking of soldiers, Russia has just banned conscript from Moscow from leaving the country. Other restrictions include bans on driving or registering vehicles, registering as a self-employed individual or entrepreneur, or receiving loans.
Information about the latest measures was sent to Moscow residents who failed to show up to military registration via text messages. Conscription, especially in Russia's largest cities, has been highly unpopular. Since the start of the invasion of Ukraine, Moscow has been suffering massive losses on the battlefield. According to UK's Defence Staff Chief, some 1,500 Russian troops were killed or injured per day in October alone. To make matters worse, Vladimir Putin has also approved a reduction in payments to wounded soldiers. Russian authorities defended this decision by saying that the previous rule on payments had created a sense of distortion among soldiers. Given these developments, the images of Russians fleeing into Georgia in the wake of the first wave of conscription in 2022 may not be a thing of the past.
Russia is also faced with problems in its airline industry. The latest media report says close to 30 Russian airlines may go bankrupt in 2023.
Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions imposed by the West, Russian airlines have been scrambling to stay afloat. Many of them rerouted their offers to countries such as China or doubled down on domestic flights. Now, close to 30 airlines responsible for up to 26% of domestic passenger travel are facing possible bankruptcy next year. Because of Western sanctions, several key industry players stopped making lease payments in 2022. Many airlines fear for their operators' certificates getting revoked over debts accumulated for leasing foreign aircraft. Only major airlines, such as Aeroflot, have been able to buy back leased aircraft with money from the Russian National Welfare Fund. For smaller fish, however, the situation looks very dire. Though they can write their debts off, these amounts are still subjected to a 25% income tax.
Outdated planes aren't the only obstacle pieces of tech that Russia is grappling with. A state-owned Russia film studio, Mosfilm, recently transferred its 1950s-era tanks to the Russian military.
Mosfilm has used the tanks as props in its movies. Now, they, along with other Soviet-era military equipment, will be repurposed for the war. The tanks in question from Mosfilm are these, the T-55s, which date back to the late 1940s and the early 1950s. Other handed-over models are the PT-76s and the T-54s. This isn't the first time that Russia has reached back for some truly ancient tech to deploy to the front line. Especially since, as we can see here, a lot of modern Russian equipment ends up like this on the front lines of Ukraine. The sheer amount of equipment that the Russian military has lost over the last 3 years of the war in Ukraine is staggering and includes thousands of tanks, artillery units, and combat vehicles.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.